Hi everyone, and good morning, and welcome to the last and final keynote session. I'm happy to introduce Lorraine Whitmarsh, who is a professor of environmental psychology at Cardiff University, and also the director of the UK Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, short also called CAST, from which you've already seen a few presentations in the last days. Lorraine's research is very much at the heart of the topic of this conference. She's an expert on public perceptions, communication, engagement, and the change of behavior in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation. I appreciate a lot that she found the time to be here with us today, as she's currently struggling with 2 full-time jobs effectively, as she's also homeschooling while the UK is on lockdown during the COVID crisis. That being said, we will start the presentation with a pre-recorded video. And after that, Lorraine will be here to answer your questions. All right, we'll start the video now.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation to join you at this conference, and thank you for being here with me today. I'm Lorraine Whitmarsh, and I'm a professor of environmental psychology at Cardiff University in the UK, and I'm the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. I'll just briefly introduce the centre first before I get into the main thing I want to talk about this morning, which is mainstreaming low-carbon lifestyles. The centre was started a year ago, and we have initially £5 million of Economic and Social Research Council funding for the first 5 years of the centre. We are a distributed research centre, so we are 4 universities and a charity. We're Cardiff, Manchester, East Anglia and York universities, and the charity Climate Outreach. And the other logos that you see here are the various other partners that have committed in one way or another to work with us in the centre to try out new ways of encouraging low carbon lifestyles, for example. The main thing that we're doing in the centre is really trying to answer this question: how can we as a society live differently and better in ways that achieve systemic, deep and rapid emission reductions? And we're focusing particularly on these 4 areas that you can see here: food, mobility, heating and cooling and material consumption. And that's because these are high emission activities and they've proven challenging to decarbonise historically. And the reason that we put that "and better" in the question is really linked to this idea of co-benefits, that we think that the best way that we can motivate people to reduce their emissions is to understand what's important to them, understand their values, and to design interventions that achieve those goals and resonate with those values, that as well as reducing emissions. So they achieve co-benefits alongside emission reductions. And we're particularly interested in the role that people can play in tackling climate change. So we talk about people as agents of change. Here, importantly though, we're not just thinking about people as being private consumers or maybe people in their roles within households, though those are important roles that people play, but also in their roles as employees, as employers, as parents, as members of communities, as citizens, maybe as leaders and decision makers with power, for example, political leaders. And we're interested in the range of contexts that people occupy, and ranging from the individual level through community, organisations, cities, right up to national level and beyond. And in those various contexts and roles that we occupy, we can exert both direct and indirect influence on emission reductions. We have 4 themes in the centre, and I won't spend much time talking about them, but just briefly to introduce them. The first one is visioning. We're interested in what could a low carbon transformed society look like in the future. So this includes some modelling work, some deliberative visioning workshops, tracking discourses through longitudinal surveys and media analysis. And you may have seen presentations by two colleagues who are working within this theme, Caroline Verfurth and Claire Hanmer, at the conference. They made some presentations on some of their initial findings in this theme. So check those out. The second theme is on learning. This is why and how have transformations occurred in the past and maybe are occurring at the moment. And here there's plenty we can learn from the current COVID situation, but also from the ways in which governments may have led transformation in the past and that grassroots change may have also occurred. The third theme is a really practical, action-oriented theme where we're trying to test out new ways of actually bringing about emission reductions by changing what people do, so their behaviours and practices across these different scales. So this is working with the various partners that we have. And the fourth theme is about engaging. So if we find things that work in the third theme, how can we embed and upscale those things? And we're also interested in what we can do as a centre to try and enact change and inspire others within higher education and beyond to adopt low carbon practices. So we're trying to be a low carbon sustainable research centre as far as we can. Moving on then to some of the kind of details of the work that we've been doing around low carbon lifestyles, a really key assumption for our work is that behaviour change and social change more generally is really critical for reaching net zero. The first keynote speaker talked about this, drawing on the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, for example, that really exemplified that. And in the UK, we've also had a recent report on net zero by the Committee on Climate Change, which quantified the contribution that social and behavioural change can make to reaching net zero through either in combination with technological change or by itself. And so that's the blue and green segments of the pie chart here, respectively, versus just technological change, the red part. So you can see that the majority of the changes required to meet net zero do involve at least some degree of social and behavioural change. So this really is the kind of foundation for the work that we're doing. But also really important is an assumption that we can't achieve this kind of radical transformation by imposing change on people. We need to work with people and understand their values, where they're coming from, and the role that they can play in bringing about change. And so here we're doing various deliberative activities, for example, in supporting the UK Citizens Assembly as well as some of the local citizens' assemblies that are ongoing, in order to really understand whether people do want a 1.5 degree future or a 4 degree future. And if they want a 1.5 degree future, how do they think we should get there? What sort of policies do they think would be acceptable? How would they be willing to change their lifestyles and so on? And so this kind of really deep deliberative work is critical for actually not just understanding what could work, but building the political mandate for that kind of radical action as well. The good news is, of course, that at least until sort of late 2019, we'd seen a really steady increase in concern about climate change and support for action to tackle it. And so in a survey that we did in the centre in late summer last year, we found that 85% of the UK public say they are very, very or fairly concerned about climate change. And we found that they also broadly supported measures to tackle climate change. For example, limiting the amount of flying we do, 2/3 supported that. And a slightly smaller majority, 53%, supporting reducing the amount of meat in our diets. Now, it's interesting to see whether people are still as concerned right now about climate change as they were a year ago. But some of the latest polling does suggest that people do support tackling climate change to a similar extent that they did this time last year. But of course, attitudes are really only one thing that influences our behaviour. So it's great that people are on board with the idea of trying to reach net zero, but that belief and that attitude alone isn't sufficient for them to actually change their own behaviour. We did a report as part of the UK government's foresight project on the future of mobility, which looked at all the evidence of what influences our travel behaviour. And we found that it was really complex. There were loads of different things that shaped why we might take the car versus public transport or active modes, or why we might buy one type of car over another type of car. And without going into all of the detail, you can see on this figure that, broadly speaking, there are kind of 4 broad categories of things which shape those choices. Looking at the kind of red circle, motivations, these are the kind of explicit things that people will say is driving their action. You know, how pleasant is the journey? How satisfying is it? To what extent do they have freedom to choose what time they leave and who they travel with? What's the price? How long is it going to take? Some pragmatic considerations. So those explicit motivations are what's captured there in the red circle. But underlying that, there are often unconscious factors which people don't necessarily know are shaping their behaviour, but for various reasons and using different types of research methods, we know that there are other things. So we know that our travel behaviours are very habitual, so we just respond to sort of cues which trigger our behaviour in a more unconscious way often. We're really strongly influenced by social norms as well, and actually people aren't necessarily aware of this, but actually what other people are doing is a really strong influence on our behaviour. And symbolism, so the kind of status inferred by maybe a different type of vehicle, is another thing which people might not necessarily say is influencing their behaviour, but actually we know it can do. There are other sorts of things in the green circle which we identified. So, for example, the people's income, the household composition, maybe they have caring roles, their various sort of life circumstances, life cycle events, and so on are captured within that, and the influence of those things often is on people's kind of motivations to use different behaviours. But really importantly, the final circle there, the orange one, is the sort of what we've called transport environment, which is the physical built environment. It's how walkable or cyclable different cities are. It's how pleasant that might be to actually walk or cycle, and how safe. It's about public transport provision, accessibility, and so on. And so there's a really large influence of those more kind of physical and infrastructural type of factors there. So that behavioural complexity then is also mapped on and kind of exhibited through the variation that we see in behaviours across different cultures. So within a project that we did, and which finished about a year ago, the CASPI project, we were interested in sustainable lifestyles across different cultures. And we identified 7 very different countries: the UK, South Africa, Poland, India, Denmark, China, and Brazil. And we asked, first of all, about the frequency that people took different pro-environmental or green behaviours in the last year. And here I've only shown 2 examples of behaviours that we asked about: recycling and using public transport, cycling or walking. And we found, as you can see, some pretty significant differences across the countries that we were surveying. So just looking at recycling, for example, the darker red colour is the most frequent that people were doing, so on at least a daily basis, through to the paler blue is not at all in the past year. So we can see that, for example, the UK here actually is doing pretty well. Most people say that they do recycle most of the time. Whereas in other countries, for example, Poland and India, recycling is rather less common. This isn't actually indicative of many of the other behaviours that we asked about, because the UK was actually much lower on most of the other behaviours that we asked about. But in the UK, the one thing that we do have is reasonable recycling facilities, and so that would probably account for why we see pretty high rates of recycling. But more generally, of course, the pictures on the right here exemplify that within some cultures, it's really normal and common to see people cycling in all weathers and for all types of journey, whereas in other cultures, of course, it's much less common. And that's partly to do with the physical infrastructure, as well as cultural norms and values, and prices and various other things as well. So the complexity that I just highlighted on the previous slide is really what came out of this study as well in terms of the variation across cultures. And just sticking with this idea about cultural variation, we did also find that people's beliefs about green actions varied across cultures. For example, we asked, to what extent do you feel that the following actions have an impact in terms of protecting the environment? And I've just shown 4 examples here: turning off the tap while you're brushing your teeth, avoiding buying new things, avoiding eating meat, and contacting a politician about an environmental issue. So there's a couple of things that come out of this figure. First of all, actually things which are only modestly good for the environment, like turning off the tap when you're brushing your teeth, generally across the board were rated as being much more impactful by participants. So people think that things that actually are relatively easy are actually good, much better for the environment than things which actually tend to be harder and less popular. So it's interesting that generally people didn't think that avoiding eating meat was as good for the environment as some of those lower impact things, when we know that actually that does tend to have a pretty high impact. The thing which I wanted to also draw out, though, was that it was interesting that we found that political and social actions were generally rated as much more impactful, and people were much more likely to be doing them in more collectivist cultures than in more individualist cultures. So you can see in India, for example, a much higher rating of the impact of contacting a politician about an environmental issue than in some other countries like the UK and Denmark. And there are going to be various reasons for doing that in terms of maybe social and political trust, as well as the extent to which people might have had experience of doing these things and so on. But we did find this as a sort of trend, that some of the collectivist actions as well tended to be more popular in more collectivist countries. Just trying to move on then to thinking about, well, given all this complexity and heterogeneity in our behaviour, how can we actually try to change behaviour to encourage low carbon lifestyles? Well, broadly speaking, we can categorise this into 2 main approaches, what we call downstream and upstream. Downstream interventions are those which influence individuals' choices directly, so they kind of influence how people think about things. So this would feature things like information campaigns, adverts, maybe kind of social approaches where we're trying to persuade people through leadership approaches or eco champion type interventions, versus more upstream interventions where we're trying to actually influence or shape the context in which people are acting. So this could include economic measures or changes to available products and services, changes to the built environment, or possibly even education if we're actually fundamentally changing kind of societal values or norms. And just to give you a couple of examples, if we're trying to encourage low carbon diets, we might want to use downstream approaches like showing people the carbon footprint of different menu choices. And this extract here on the right comes from a menu from a National Trust property in the UK, where they were trialling showing the CO2 impact of different menu choices. And you can see that the meat option there, the lamb and damson stew, has a much higher carbon footprint. And so that could be one way in which we could shape behaviour, is by showing the carbon footprint of different choices. Another way, in a more upstream approach, would be to actually change menus so that we have fewer meat options available on canteen menus, and that's been shown to significantly reduce the amount of meat that people are buying. So even still having it available, but just less choice means that people are less likely to buy it. Ideally, though, we need to have a combination of downstream and upstream approaches. And that's really one of the key findings from the literature on behaviour change, is that we need to have generally multiple interventions because of the multiple factors that shape our behaviour, as I've shown previously. And really to kind of emphasise the point that information alone probably isn't going to be enough. We've done some studies showing that, in fact, information can have little impact on people's attitudes towards climate change. In fact, it can simply polarize audiences. So in one study we did a few years ago, we gave a group of participants, some of whom we'd surveyed previously and found were more skeptical about climate change, and some we'd categorised as being not skeptical and that were basically concerned about climate change. And we gave them 2 newspaper editorials on climate change. One was a more kind of skeptical article, and one was more advocating action to tackle climate change. And then we asked participants, having read these 2 articles, did you become more or less convinced about climate change? The people that believed in climate change, the non-skeptics, said they became slightly more convinced about climate change, whereas the skeptics, as you can see, became significantly less convinced about climate change. And this suggests that there was some attitude polarization going here, people just reinforcing their existing attitudes rather than actually changing them and becoming more similar to others within the broader group. And this is what we generally do see when we look at how information about climate change is perceived, that we get information about the issue from various sources, but all of that information is filtered through a range of different biases, including our pre-existing beliefs, our values, and other sorts of heuristics. And so that's why we have a lot of variation within the population in terms of how people understand the issue, even if a lot of the information that is provided is quite similar. And that makes it very difficult if we're actually trying to persuade people that they need to do something about climate change. Because for people who have maybe different sorts of value sets, maybe they're not as interested in environmental issues as other people, it can be quite difficult to engage those audiences. But there is something that we can do, which is to reframe the way in which we talk about climate change and taking action to tackle climate change in ways that resonate more with audiences' values. So we did this in one study, for example, a few years ago, where we disaggregated audiences according to their political values. So you can see here that we broadly, we had a kind of a scale of political orientation, and we just did 3 equal sized groups. So we had the green bars are the people who scored that they had high left-wing political values. The kind of pink colour there is people who had centrist or slightly right of centre political values, and the blue bar are the people that had further right of centre values. And we gave them 3 different narratives for reasons why we might take action on climate change. So we talked either in terms of being more energy efficient and conserving energy to avoid being wasteful. So that was the waste narrative. And we said it was kind of common sense that you would avoid being wasteful. The second narrative tried to resonate with values around Britishness, national identity, patriotism, and self-sufficiency, and talked about the opportunities for producing energy within the UK, and that there would be benefits to jobs as well as energy self-sufficiency, whereas the final narrative was really a more kind of justice-oriented narrative, where we talked about it only being fair that people with more resources and in more developed countries should take action because they have been more responsible for causing climate change. And what we found, and unsurprisingly, the justice narrative was the one that was most supported by people on the left of centre and least on the right. And the further left you move through the narratives there, you can see that actually there was greater consensus the more that we move towards the waste narrative. So this idea of frugality, which underpinned that waste narrative, really had the broadest political appeal, and we saw the least polarization there. So although the differences here are not huge, this study and others that show different ways of reframing the issue do suggest that actually you can have significant differences in how people respond to messages according to how you frame them, and that they're more receptive if they're in tune with their values. Just the final thing I want to say about information is that also we can use messaging in its broadest sense to give people a sense of collective action about climate change. And so it's really important because people often feel that there's no point taking action on climate change because what they do as an individual doesn't make a difference. So in order to build this sense of self-efficacy, we need to kind of give people a sense that actually they're part of a broader collective effort. So they actually build a broader collective efficacy. And we did that in one study where we gave people information about actions that other people are taking to tackle climate change. And importantly, the most effective way of framing that was when we talked about people like me, so that could be your national identity in this case, versus people from other countries. So the more we're talking about people that are similar to us in some ways, the more we feel we're willing to take action ourselves. But also people seem to be particularly inspired by leaders, people that actually had a lot of resource and power to take action. When they were seen as taking action, people were more willing to act themselves as well. And importantly, that pink box you can see in the middle there is that this increased intention to act on climate change, when we gave people this social information, was mediated by the perception that it's fair to do that. In other words, people felt that them personally taking action was fairer when it was part of a collective effort. So this was this kind of distributional justice kind of idea. So that seems to be something else which I think we can maybe explore further, is actually building this sense of collective action and what actually does make an inspiring leader. Just before I finish, and there's loads more I could say about low carbon lifestyle change, but one of the things we're increasingly doing work on is around when to intervene, so getting the timing right. So we know that habits are one of the biggest barriers to behaviour change. And in the presence of a strong habit, people tend not to pay attention to other ways of doing things, alternative options. So somebody who drives all the time, for example, won't pay any attention to information about bus timetables or bus travel. And that means it's really difficult to actually break habits and get people to think about new ways of doing things, particularly if we're only relying on things like information hypothesis. And there's really a growing literature that shows that interventions targeted to these times when habits are disrupted can be more effective than the same intervention applied when habits are more stable. So Bamberg some years ago showed this in a study where he gave citizens within a German city some public transport information and a one-day bus pass to try the bus, to encourage people to use more public transport. And he gave this intervention to people who had recently moved house, the relocated group, and people who had not recently moved house, the not relocated group. And you can see here that it was only amongst those people who had moved house in the last few weeks that there was a significant impact of the intervention on their bus use. And in fact, it much more than doubled the bus use amongst that group. And although the evidence is somewhat mixed, there does seem to be a growing evidence base that the more that we can target our interventions to these times when habits are disrupted, the more likely they are to be effective. And so I think this obviously raises the question of the extent to which COVID might be a moment of disruption or a moment of change in which we could potentially promote low carbon lifestyles. And Angela, in her keynote speech yesterday, talked a bit about this as well. And I think this is a really exciting area of research that we can look at, because lockdown, of course, has disrupted an awful lot of habits. It's a time when we are doing a lot more virtual interaction. Zoom is becoming something that we use very regularly for many people. We are probably doing things very differently in our homes. We might be cooking more rather than eating out or getting takeaways. And there are various other ways that I think people's habits are probably changing, some of which might be more sustainable than pre-COVID, some of which may be less. But for those lower carbon habits that people might be adopting now, this is a really good opportunity then to try and lock in those habits with appropriate infrastructure change, incentives, norms, etc. So there's a lot of discussion now about the extent to which the stimulus package to reinvigorate the economy after the lockdown will be a green stimulus package. Will it actually incorporate net zero policies? And we're already seeing some really encouraging signs from, for example, what Milan is doing to actually give over a significant proportion of the road space to cyclists and pedestrians, so that when the lockdown is fully lifted, there will actually be a lower carbon transport infrastructure waiting for people to use. So I think while obviously there's a lot of things to do with COVID which are terrible and tragic, and this is a really difficult time for a lot of people, there is a reason to think that there might be an opportunity here to think about what we can do about low carbon lifestyles. And so just to conclude then, I've argued that really behaviour change is an essential part of reaching net zero, and there are lots of things we can do to achieve that. I think we need to focus on the high impact behaviours I mentioned: mobility, food, consumption, heating. And we also need to reach net zero in a way that is working with people, so engaging with communities and citizens, understanding people's values and needs, explaining the issues, what are the trade-offs and co-benefits of trying to reach 1.5 degrees. And I think fairness is a really key element of what's acceptable and workable for those policies. We need to design interventions that actually deliver co-benefits, so health benefits, for example, of active travel or low carbon diets, and to really frame the information that we give our audiences so that it does highlight those co-benefits, so it actually resonates with what matters to people. We need to implement both downstream and upstream interventions. So we need to leverage social norms, we need to use economic measures, we need to redesign cities, as well as giving people information in order to address the multiple influences on people's behaviour. And really crucially, we need to get the timing right. So we need to target our interventions to when people's habits are disrupted, and now might be a really good time to start to do that. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to your questions.
All right, welcome again, Lorraine. Thank you for the talk. I personally really enjoyed it. I did not watch it in advance, so that I experienced it fresh. So there's a lot of questions. Is your audio on?
Yeah.
Can we hear you? All right, perfect. So let's go through the questions. In the beginning, there were two questions about representativeness in the kind of research you do. So Esteva asks how wide representative of national populations were your CASPI project surveys? And if they are representative, how did you deliver or administer them? And Graham kind of put this on the next level and asks, how can we undo the handcuffs of nationalized or regionalized research and extrapolate findings and importance more globally? And he adds, is it that data availability is still so different between governments or regions?
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. So to answer the first one, we did the survey online. So we used a Qualtrics panel. So they have a pool of participants in the different countries. And we drew a sample of 1,000 participants in each of the 7 countries. And they were representative demographically of those countries. So age, gender, income, and so they obviously, you can't get everybody through online surveys because not everybody has access to a computer, but in most of the countries we were surveying, actually we did do quite well to broadly represent the general public. The other one about kind of more generally, how do you sort of do cross-cultural research? I think having done a couple of projects like this now, I can see why people often don't, because it can be expensive, time-consuming, and challenging in various ways. You need to spend time not just translating questionnaires and materials, but checking, back translating them, checking them again, working with collaborators within the different countries to check that the items and the things that you're talking about are culturally sensitive and appropriate. Is this even a behavioural option in this country? Which is why you might have spotted in some of the questions we didn't ask in all of the countries because they just weren't appropriate. So that's part of it. And then in the analysis, you need to kind of also account for some, cross-cultural factors as well. And how much can you say this is down to kind of national differences. And so there's analytical techniques you need to use as well. And it's expensive. So that's maybe some of the reasons why people just like to stick with their own country and try not to do too much cross-culturally. But you learn an enormous amount, of course, if you do that. And you can't always tell exactly why you might see differences between countries. That's one of the kind of frustrating things, is you would need to have a sample of many hundreds of countries to kind of be able to identify maybe why you see these differences. But we start to see maybe why you see trends in certain directions, e.g. between individualist and collectivist cultures, because we definitely had several in each of those categories in our sample. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you. The next question I see is a more psychological one. Can you explain why people assume easy actions have more impact? Is this due to lack of knowledge or due to a kind of biased justification, perception that they assume that what they're willing to do will also have a high impact?
Yeah, this is a great question. We wanted to know this, actually. And we did start to do some follow-up research to really separate out whether it was motivated reasoning, basically whether people just wanted to justify the fact that they only really did quite low impact things. And so therefore saying, well, eating less meat and flying less probably isn't that good for the environment, just to kind of make themselves feel better. Or was it that genuinely they didn't know that those things were much more impactful? And I don't think we had a completely clear answer. It seemed to be a bit of both. And that if you gave people more information about the impacts of some of those high impact behaviours, to some extent they were a bit more willing to change them, but still there was a lot of resistance because people are in different countries and different groups are more attached to meat eating and flying, and there may be structural constraints that mean that it is difficult for maybe some people to change some of those higher impact behaviours. So I think we kind of concluded it was a bit of both, basically. There's a bit of motivated reasoning going on there, probably justifying why people aren't doing higher impact stuff. But it is the case that probably people don't realize quite how much of an impact some of those behaviors would make.
You also mentioned that economic aspects are a factor as well that influences behavioral outcomes. And adding to this, Andre is asking, do you think people could receive some financial compensation for changing behavior? Thinking in the context of low-income population with distinct priority agendas such as securing basic livelihood in urban and rural areas in the global south.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the cost of things, prices, people's income is a huge impact on their ability and willingness to take those behaviors. So obviously we need to kind of have low carbon options be economically accessible for people and attractive for people. And I think that's an important, so I think taxation and economic incentives and disincentives are really a part of the solution. The slight caveat I would say is that we do also know from some psychological research that if you only talk about the economic benefits of doing things, you can really foster a more kind of extrinsic motivation or a value set which is more self-oriented. So you're only ever looking out for, well, what's the cheapest option? What's the benefit to me personally and financially? And so you could crowd out some of those more extrinsic motivations and sort of doing good, altruism, pro-environmental values, etc. So there's obviously that literature that suggests that prices aren't all of the answer, and we maybe shouldn't think that they're the only thing that would motivate people. So I think they're a sort of prerequisite. We need to make things affordable to people that are low carbon, but not kind of assume it's the whole answer.
That seems to be your general message, right? That there's no one aspect that provides the whole answer.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So Jaco Quist is asking another question regarding your methods, and one that you touched maybe a bit less on your talk. He says, my question is if you can say more in how to use the visions to facilitate behavioral change, what kind of methods are used and what kind of results you can get, as normally visioning is more widely used to facilitate system rather than behavioral change.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So in the center, the way in which we're using visioning and as part of kind of deliberative workshops is more to inform, I suppose, that system change in the sense that we're interested in what policies are the public would they accept and would fit with their kind of value set, so that policymakers then can act on that and intervene to encourage those changes in a way that would be more socially acceptable and robust. So I think that's kind of one of the main ways we're using it. But that said, I don't think there is a lot of research that looks at, for the participants in those activities, what is the impact of thinking through a low carbon future and how to get there. And we're also doing work in the UK Climate Assembly, the Citizens Assembly on Climate Change, and local citizens assemblies. And there we are going to be, and we are doing some evaluation research looking at how the participants in that process are changing their attitudes towards climate change and potentially their willingness to act. And I think it's almost certainly going to have an impact on those people. Obviously, when they step out of that deliberative process, they will still have the same constraints on their lifestyle. So they may still find it very difficult to take low carbon action. So they might be inspired, maybe they'll write some letters to their politician, and maybe they will even change some behaviors. But I think we can't expect that process, even if it's sort of attitudinally transformative, will necessarily be transformative in people's lifestyles, because we need that broader system change. So, but I think it's a bit of a research gap, actually. So it's a good question.
Good to hear. So Stefan Drews asked a question that also regards a bit this difference between systemic or individual actions. He cites a study from Nisa et al. 2019 that says behavioral interventions have small effects on households' emissions. And his question is if we just have to do better research to make such interventions more effective, or if we should focus more strongly on political actions.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things there. So yeah, absolutely. I think in the past, the research that's looked at behavior change has tended to look at relatively low impact behaviors, and they have worked, modestly well. So we know how to encourage people to recycle, maybe to switch off some lights and so on. But there hasn't been as much focus on really high impact behaviors like avoiding flying, cutting down meat and dairy, maybe changing kind of consumption patterns more generally, things that would be really high impact. There's less evidence. So I think that's maybe partly explains why the impact of some of the studies has been modest in the past, because of the focus on low impact behaviors. The second thing is, I think that behaviors are often defined in a relatively narrow sense, in that they're kind of seen as maybe things that private individuals do, this sort of private sphere idea, consumption, for example, or waste behaviors in the home. And yeah, definitely those sorts of things can have an impact. We can take those actions, but there's a lot that we can do within other contexts, for example, as decision makers within organizations, employees at work as well, members of communities, political leaders. So we can ask another question: why is it that some city leaders take action to tackle climate change? Why do they declare a climate emergency? Or why is Milan or Barcelona or Brussels doing what they're doing at the moment to kind of reduce road space to increase walking and cycling? Well, those are people. So they are changing their behavior in some sense. They're taking actions, which is behavior in the broader sense. So if we understand it in that way, then behavior change is also about changing systems, I think. So it really depends, I think, what you define as behavior, but in our center, at least, we define it very broadly.
All right, so it would be a household action to be politically active. There would also be individual behavior.
Absolutely, yeah, I would say so.
That's very interesting. All right, another question. So you mentioned that the current COVID situation has kind of like opened a certain door because it has disrupted habits and also created new habits. In that sense, Peter asks, timing appears to be good right now, but how do we get decision makers to implement low carbon living measures? Too many people right now are very distracted.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I think that's the big question at the moment is we have this opportunity, but how can we actually motivate people who have power to use it? And I think part of it comes down to this idea of co-benefits. So if we know that, people are preoccupied by COVID, so their motivation is how can we encourage social distancing? How can we maybe get the economy up and running again and people back into work? And and generally, I suppose, health concerns as well. So if we kind of try and identify what might be the interventions that address those concerns, and they're important concerns, alongside achieving net zero, then I think we can try and, we'll be able to kind of enlist decision makers and political leaders to achieve a net zero future, which also achieves those other COVID related goals. And so I guess one example might be, we were just talking before the call, so I hope you don't mind me using your Barcelona example, that some of the streets in Barcelona are being, the road space is being taken away partly to enable cafes to have like chairs and tables out, so that I guess people are spaced further apart, so that you reduce the risk of infection, but you enable cafes to open, so you have an economic benefit. You also have a social benefit because then people can actually interact again, which is what people are really missing at the moment. So I think if we can identify those sorts of strategies that achieve, COVID-related co-benefits alongside net zero type benefits, in this case, reducing road space so that hopefully longer term people aren't driving so much. And I think health co-benefits are really often one of the biggest ones that you can achieve through net zero action. There was a paper by the Grantham Institute that showed this, and Caroline Verfurth talked about this in her talk yesterday. Then I think, this is how we have a chance to really motivate people. The UK Committee on Climate Change the day before yesterday wrote a big report about this too, how we can have a green stimulus package post-COVID. So there are ways that you can achieve both, and I think that's how we need to move forward.
The co-benefits is clearly the word I will take out of this session. So Seren moves on from this current disruption of habit and already anticipates future not so nice things that will happen. So he asked, we will have heat waves and other extreme events occurring regularly within the next decade. Could these phases also be seen as windows of opportunities for behavior change, like the current COVID disruption?
Yeah, another really great question. This is how I actually started my research, was asking the question, do people who have experienced flooding, are they more motivated to tackle climate change? Are they doing more to tackle climate change? And actually in my study, which was many years ago, over a decade ago, I found no, there was no difference at all between people who had been flooded and people who had not been flooded, and their concern about climate change or their action to tackle climate change. And it seemed that they saw the two issues as relatively separate, that their flooding problem was something that they defined as fairly local, that they could identify maybe some blocked ditches and drains or local development that was causing runoff to exacerbate their problem. And there was actions that they could, as a householder, potentially take to protect themselves. They could put up floodboards or move things higher in the house. And so it was locally defined, and as individuals they felt they had some efficacy. Whereas with climate change, well, it seemed global, it seemed very uncertain, the links with their own problem were a bit vague. So it didn't seem like having experienced flooding made any difference at that point. Subsequent studies show there can be, in as far as people who are already concerned about climate change and already believe it's a problem, if they experience a drought or a flood or some extreme weather event, it exacerbates that pre-existing concern. So it's this idea of polarization again, whereas the people that don't believe, that they aren't necessarily any more convinced by that it exists, because they'll still say, well, it's just a one-off event. We've had this in the past and it's maybe a natural occurrence or something. So it doesn't necessarily persuade them. So it kind of, I think it can maybe, in as far as it serves any sort of purpose, it can help to make the impacts of climate change more real to people who at least have some belief that it's a real issue. So it can maybe serve as a sort of a way of starting a dialogue about, well, what does it actually mean? What does climate change mean for people? How can we, live in a climate change world, and what do we want to do about it? But I don't think there is necessarily a link between experiencing an extreme weather event and changing your own behavior. It's not quite that straightforward.
You already, in your response, mentioned some conversational questions, and there's a question in this direction from Theo. He asks, from a psychological point of view, what is the best way to engage with a climate denier to try to reduce polarization? As you said, to appeal to emotions, their values or logic.
Yeah, so I guess all the research on communication shows that there are different ways that you can tailor messages to be effective to different groups, but tailoring is really the key thing. That a blanket approach will not be as effective as if you actually are more specific in the way that you create your messaging so that it resonates with people's values or emotions or prior beliefs. We've looked particularly at values, and so the reason that I showed the study about the political polarization is because the people on the right of centre politically are more likely to be skeptical about climate change or just disinterested altogether, versus the people on the left are generally a bit more engaged. So it kind of maps onto that skepticism dimension. And so we can basically say that the more that you actually talk about climate change per se and the benefits of reducing emissions being, a greener planet and, tackling climate change in very explicit terms, you'll only really engage people that believe in climate change and that maybe have green values. The more you talk in terms of, well, co-benefits again, or other sorts of values, then the more you're likely to be able to appeal to a broader group of people, including skeptics. So again, Paul Bain has done work specifically looking at how we can engage with skeptics, and he found that talking about kind of community benefits and sort of what's good for society is a really good way of actually engaging a really broad population, including hardened climate skeptics, to save energy. So, but you just don't mention climate change because that's kind of like a trigger, and then they're like, oh, well, this is just bullshit. So so you have to kind of reframe your message and think about, well, what is the co-benefit here? How might it appeal to somebody who is a skeptic? But just don't engage on climate change. It's a waste of time.
Good advice. Thank you. So the next question would be about the other half, about the people who already are technically in favor of acting on climate change, but you touched it in your talk. There is often a value action gap. So Anjali asks, there's often a lag or imbalance in what people say is the right thing needed for the environment and what they actually end up doing. Has there been any focus on comparing the two to see how far or close to the ideal situation we are?
Comparing, just trying to read the question myself.
Comparing values and action, I think, is meant.
Like, so how big the gap is, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, good question. Well, I guess it probably depends on the behavior you're looking at. So I suppose we can look at the prevalence of different behaviors and map that in terms of, or compare that in terms of people's values. And because we know, well, let's take the UK example, like virtually everybody recycles. They say they're concerned about the environment. So there's a small gap there. But the more you get into actually high impact behaviors, so cutting down meat consumption, flying, driving, there's generally a bigger gap. So I think trying to generalize, I think we can say the gap is smaller for easier behaviors because it's easier for people to enact their values for things that are kind of low cost and low inconvenience. It's harder for people to enact their values when there might be major structural constraints. Well, we talked about prices, but infrastructure or cultural norms, etc., that might get in the way of them doing the green thing.
All right. Thank you, Lorraine. We're already at the end of our session, but we can continue this discussion in your respective channel in the forum. I will post the chat log there so that the questions are not lost. And sorry for the questions I didn't ask. There were a lot of questions, but this means there was a lot of interest in your talk. So yeah, let's continue discussion in the forum. I also want to remind people there's a lot of interesting posters that touch upon similar topics. Like, for example, poster 18 on the incentives and barriers on air travel behavior, or poster 10 on the public acceptance of the carbon tax and the false consensus bias, or poster 9 on framing mechanisms in relation to energy saving. That being said, we will now continue with our session P3 on policy experiments. And I want to thank you again very much, Lorraine, and we will end the talk here.
Thank you very much.